"Sit," Bumpy Johnson said calmly, his voice barely rising above the hum of conversation. The room didn't go silent. It didn't need to. Everyone within earshot felt the temperature change the moment those words were spoken. The man standing across from him hadn't expected to hear that voice again. Not after 11 years. Not after Alcatraz. Not after everything he'd done to make sure this day never came. Bumpy Johnson had been gone for more than a decade, buried behind concrete walls and steel doors on an island designed to erase men from memory. Most people assumed he'd either die there or come back broken, quiet, grateful just to breathe free air again. But the man standing in front of Harlem that night was neither broken nor quiet. He looked older, yes. Time had threaded gray through his hair and etched lines into his face. But his eyes were unchanged, steady, cold, and impossibly focused. The kind of eyes that remembered every betrayal, every name, every debt. The other man knew those eyes well. Dutch Schultz had spent years convincing himself he'd never see them again. Years telling himself that prison had done the job bullets couldn't. That the paperwork, the indictments, the pressure he'd quietly arranged had finished what open war couldn't. 11 years was supposed to be enough to erase a rival completely. 11 years was supposed to turn a king into a rumor. But rumors don't walk into rooms and take control without raising their voice. Bumpy hadn't announced his return. He hadn't sent messages or warnings. He hadn't gathered an army. He simply appeared, exactly where he knew he'd be seen. And now, for the first time since the day he was sent away, the man responsible was standing face to face with the consequence of that decision. Dutch Schultz had faced gunmen, police raids, and rivals hungry for blood. None of that prepared him for this, because violence could be negotiated. This couldn't. Around them, people pretended not to stare. Forks hovered midair. Conversations trailed off into uneasy murmurs. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unfinished finally being resumed. This wasn't a reunion. It wasn't a negotiation. It was the collision of past and present, of patience and arrogance, of a man who waited 11 years and a man who thought 11 years was enough to be safe. Bumpy leaned back slightly, unhurried, as if time had always been on his side. For him, it had been. The real question now wasn't whether Dutch Schultz would answer for what he'd done. It was how much of his world would survive once Bumpy Johnson finished reminding everyone why sending him to prison had never meant sending him away. What stood between Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz wasn't just history. It was the future of Harlem itself. 11 years earlier, Schultz hadn't merely removed a rival. He had dismantled an entire order. With Bumpy locked inside Alcatraz, Harlem became vulnerable. Lines of control blurred. Old rules stopped being enforced. Outsiders moved in, carving up territory that had once operated under a strict code. Schultz's success depended on one thing remaining true. Bumpy Johnson could never return with his authority intact. If this meeting ended without consequence, the message would travel faster than any bullet ever could. It would tell every hustler, every operator, every rival watching from the shadows that patience meant nothing, that loyalty was optional, and that power could be stolen permanently if you were willing to hide behind indictments and distance. It would mean that prison, not respect, was the final judge of leadership. And for a man like Bumpy, that outcome was worse than death. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about settling a score for pride or emotion. It was about restoring a balance that had been deliberately broken. Schultz had sent Bumpy to Alcatraz believing time would erase memory and fear would replace loyalty. If Bumpy walked away now, Harlem would belong to men who believed survival justified betrayal. Every structure Bumpy had built before prison would collapse under that lesson. For Schultz, the stakes were just as severe, even if he didn't fully understand them yet. He had built his empire on the assumption that Bumpy's absence was permanent. His alliances, protections, and confidence all rested on that single belief. If Bumpy reclaimed authority here, publicly, calmly, without hesitation, then Schultz's power would unravel in real time. Not because of violence, but because everyone watching would know exactly who still commanded respect. This moment would decide whether 11 years in Alcatraz had erased a king or merely delayed his return. There would be no middle ground, no quiet resolution. When this night ended, Harlem would belong fully to one man again. The only question was which one. Understood. Below is Section 3 only. Written as a standalone document, paragraph format, same tone and pacing, no scene or clip suggestions. Long before prison numbers and indictments entered the picture, Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz existed in the same ecosystem without openly colliding. They were different men, shaped by different worlds, but operating in spaces that were always destined to overlap. Harlem was Bumpy's domain, not because he claimed it loudly, but because he enforced order quietly. The numbers ran clean. The streets stayed predictable. Violence was controlled, not celebrated. People knew where they stood, and more importantly, who they stood under. Schultz, on the other hand, thrived on expansion. His reach grew through pressure, intimidation, and relentless ambition. Where Bumpy valued structure, Schultz valued dominance. Harlem fascinated him not because it was chaotic, but because it wasn't. That kind of stability meant someone was holding it together, and to Schultz, that someone represented both an obstacle and an opportunity. As long as Bumpy stood firm, Harlem resisted being absorbed into anyone else's empire. At first, there was no open war. There didn't need to be. Mutual awareness replaced confrontation. Each man understood the other's reputation well enough to know that a direct clash would be costly. Bumpy had the streets. Schultz had reach, money, and connections beyond Harlem. The balance held, not because of friendship or respect, but because both men knew exactly what a mistake would cost. But power rarely stays balanced forever. Schultz wanted more than coexistence. Harlem wasn't just another territory, it was symbolic. Controlling it meant rewriting who held influence in New York's criminal hierarchy. Bumpy's refusal to bend, to share, or to disappear quietly turned him into a problem that couldn't be solved through negotiation. Schultz didn't need Bumpy dead. He needed him gone. And that distinction would define everything that followed. The tension between them never announced itself with gunfire or headlines. It built slowly, invisibly, in courtrooms, offices, and whispered conversations. By the time Bumpy sensed the ground shifting beneath him, the machinery was already in motion. The alliance that never existed had become a rivalry that could no longer remain unresolved. Prison would become the battlefield Schultz chose, because it was the one place where Bumpy's control couldn't reach. Understood. Below is Section 4 only. Written as a separate document, paragraph format, same pacing and tone, no scene or clip suggestions. What finally removed Bumpy Johnson from Harlem wasn't a gunfight or a street war. It was paperwork, carefully arranged charges, quiet cooperation between people who never appeared together in public. Dutch Schultz understood something many men didn't. Killing a rival created martyrs, but burying one in the system erased them without noise. Prison was cleaner, safer, permanent if done correctly. The pressure didn't come all at once. It arrived in layers. Informants suddenly knew too much. Routes that had been stable for years were exposed. Names that had never appeared in official reports began showing up in sealed documents. Bumpy noticed the pattern, but by the time it became undeniable, the damage was already done. The net tightened quietly, the way it always does when someone powerful wants a problem solved without fingerprints. Schultz's role was never visible, and that was the point. He didn't need to testify or threaten. He leaned on influence, favors owed, and doors that only opened for men with money and reach. Law enforcement attention that had once been manageable turned relentless. Charges stacked in ways that made fighting them nearly impossible. Each accusation fed the next until the outcome was no longer in doubt. When the sentence came down, it wasn't just prison. It was Alcatraz. Isolation. Distance. A place designed to sever men from their networks and erase their relevance. Schultz didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't need to. The result spoke for itself. Harlem, without its anchor, was suddenly open territory. And for 11 years, Schultz watched from a distance as Bumpy Johnson disappeared behind concrete walls, confident the system had done what violence never could. But prison doesn't erase memory. It sharpens it. While Schultz expanded and consolidated power, Bumpy counted time differently. Every year inside wasn't forgotten, it was recorded. Every loss outside wasn't dismissed, it was remembered. Alcatraz was supposed to be the end of the story. Instead, it became the place where the next chapter was planned. Understood, below is Section 5 only. Written as a standalone document, paragraph format, same tone and pacing, no scene or clip suggestions. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of Alcatraz after 11 years, there was no crowd waiting and no announcement made. He carried what little he owned and said nothing about where he was going next. Freedom didn't excite him. It focused him. Prison had taken time, not clarity, and every step he took away from the island felt measured, deliberate, as if the real sentence was finally beginning. He didn't rush back into Harlem demanding answers. He didn't send word ahead or test the waters. Men who had survived as long as Bumpy had learned that impatience was a luxury. He observed first. Listened. Let the city reveal what had changed while he was gone. Names had shifted. Faces were new. Some people who once stood tall now avoided eye contact, unsure whether the past had truly returned or if this was just another rumor refusing to die. What struck Bumpy most wasn't what had been taken from him, but how comfortably others had lived in his absence. The order he'd enforced had been replaced with opportunism. Alliances were thinner. Respect had been traded for convenience. Harlem still functioned, but it no longer moved with intention. That told him everything he needed to know. The city remembered him, but it no longer feared the consequences of forgetting. There was only one question that mattered now, and Bumpy asked it quietly. Not where power sat, but who believed it belonged to them. The answer led back to the same name prison walls couldn't erase. Dutch Schultz had built his confidence on the assumption that time was irreversible, that men came back diminished, if they came back at all. Bumpy understood the danger of that belief. It created carelessness, and carelessness always revealed itself eventually. By the time Bumpy decided to step into the open, the decision had already been made years earlier. This wasn't a reunion, and it wasn't revenge fueled by anger. It was the completion of something interrupted. 11 years hadn't cooled the conflict between him and Schultz. They had refined it. And now, with his feet back on Harlem ground, Bumpy Johnson moved forward knowing that the man who sent him to Alcatraz was about to learn what prison had never taken from him: authority. Understood, below is Section 6 only. Written as a standalone document, paragraph format, same tone and pacing, no scene or clip suggestions. The moment Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz occupied the same space again, control became the only thing that mattered. No words were raised. No threats were made. Yet everyone close enough to sense it understood that this was not an ordinary meeting. Schultz had expected fear when this day came. Fear, rage, chaos. What unsettled him, instead, was Bumpy's stillness. Prison had not made him reckless. It had made him precise. Schultz spoke first, and the effort showed. His confidence, built over 11 uninterrupted years, wavered under the weight of a man who refused to rush or react. Bumpy listened without interrupting, without expression, as if measuring each word not for meaning but for weakness. The power shift didn't happen when voices rose or tempers flared. It happened in the pauses, in the way Bumpy allowed silence to stretch until Schultz felt compelled to fill it. This was the moment Schultz realized his mistake. He had mistaken absence for surrender, distance for defeat. The man in front of him wasn't there to negotiate the past or explain the future. He was there to reclaim ownership of it. Every attempt Schultz made to frame his actions as necessity, survival, or business collapsed under Bumpy's quiet gaze. Excuses required agreement. Authority did not. Bumpy finally spoke, not to accuse, but to remind. He didn't list crimes or recount years lost. He referenced choices, decisions Schultz had made when he believed there would be no reckoning. Each sentence landed without urgency, stripping away the illusion that this meeting could end without consequence. Schultz's strength had always come from pressure and intimidation. Bumpy offered neither, and that absence unnerved him more than any threat ever could. By the time the conversation ended, the outcome was already understood. Not because Bumpy declared it, but because Schultz felt it. Control had shifted without violence, without spectacle, and without debate. The confrontation didn't resolve the conflict, it defined it. Whatever came next would no longer be decided by the man who sent another to prison, but by the one who returned unchanged. The collapse didn't arrive with shouting or violence. It came quietly, the way realization always does when there's nowhere left to hide. Dutch Schultz had built his confidence on the belief that time erased consequences. But sitting across from Bumpy Johnson, he understood that time had done the opposite. It had stripped away distractions and left only truth. Schultz's words slowed, his posture tightened, and the certainty he once carried began to unravel under the weight of what he was facing. Bumpy didn't need to threaten him. He didn't need to raise his voice or reach for a weapon. He allowed Schultz to speak, just long enough to reveal the fear beneath the bravado. Every explanation sounded thinner than the last. Survival, business, necessity. Each justification collapsed under the simple fact that Schultz had acted believing there would never be accountability. Now, the man he tried to erase was sitting calmly in front of him, unmoved by excuses and untouched by regret. This was the moment Schultz realized he no longer controlled the outcome. His influence, his alliances, even his reputation depended on the illusion that Bumpy Johnson had been finished. That illusion was gone, and once it vanished, everything built on top of it became unstable. Schultz's strength had always come from intimidation, but intimidation only worked when it was believed. In Bumpy's presence, it wasn't. The collapse wasn't physical, but it was complete. Schultz stopped arguing, stopped framing, stopped pretending this meeting could end on his terms. He saw the truth clearly now. Prison had not weakened Bumpy. It had preserved him. While others grew careless in comfort, Bumpy had grown patient in confinement. And patience, Schultz understood too late, was the most dangerous advantage of all. By the time silence settled between them, the balance had already shifted beyond recovery. Schultz hadn't lost because he was outmatched in force. He had lost because he misjudged the man he thought he had buried. And in that quiet realization, Dutch Schultz collapsed, not in body, but in power, authority, and certainty. The reckoning he believed he'd avoided for 11 years had finally arrived. The impact of that night did not need time to spread. By the following morning, Harlem already knew who had won without being told. Men who had aligned themselves with Dutch Schultz began pulling back quietly, canceling meetings, avoiding familiar routes, and reassessing loyalties that had once felt secure. Power has a way of announcing itself without words, and the silence that followed the confrontation spoke louder than any declaration ever could. For years, Schultz's confidence had rested on one assumption, that Bumpy Johnson belonged to the past. Once that assumption collapsed, everything connected to it weakened. Agreements that had once been enforced by fear lost their weight. Promises made in Bumpy's absence suddenly felt temporary. Men who had prospered while he was gone understood something instinctively. Whatever protection they thought they had no longer applied. Bumpy did not chase anyone down or issue threats. He didn't need to. His return reintroduced consequences into a world that had grown comfortable without them. Those who had overstepped during his absence corrected themselves quickly. Some left Harlem altogether. Others reached out discreetly, not to negotiate, but to signal compliance. The lesson was clear. Survival now depended on respect, not opportunity. Schultz's reach began to shrink without confrontation. Allies distanced themselves, sensing that proximity carried risk. Influence that had once seemed untouchable now required defense, explanation, justification. That was the true cost of losing authority. It forced effort where ease once existed. Bumpy, meanwhile, reclaimed ground simply by being present. His name resurfaced in conversations not as a memory, but as a fact. Within days, the balance of Harlem had been restored without violence. Not because men feared retaliation, but because they recognized stability when they saw it. Order returned the same way it always had under Bumpy Johnson. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. The aftermath proved what the confrontation had already made clear. Power does not need chaos to reassert itself. Sometimes, all it takes is the right man coming back at the right moment. The story of Bumpy Johnson is not a lesson in violence, but in patience. 11 years of isolation did not weaken him because his power was never rooted in force alone. It lived in memory, reputation, and the quiet understanding that actions eventually come due. Men who rushed for advantage mistook time for protection. They learned too late that consequences do not expire simply because they are delayed. Bumpy did not return seeking chaos. He returned to restore order, and he did it without speeches, without war, and without needing to explain himself. That is why his name survived prison, why his authority resurfaced intact, and why those who betrayed him never truly escaped the cost of that decision. In the end, power revealed itself not in what was taken, but in what could not be taken away. If this story of patience, loyalty, and consequence made you think, take a moment to subscribe and join the conversation. Drop a like if you believe real power is built over time, not seized in a moment. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done after 11 years? Would you have chosen revenge, restraint, or something else entirely?